My name is Malene Harper. At Thanksgiving dinner, my parents stood to make a toast. I thought, maybe, for once, they'd acknowledge me. Instead, they raised their glasses to my little brother, called him their legacy, and announced he'd inherit everything. Then my father looked at me and said, "You've been a burden we've carried for 18 years." That was their celebration. That was the moment I disappeared from their story. But what they didn't know is that burdens don't stay quiet forever. If any part of this story feels familiar, leave a comment. And if you're still listening, hit subscribe. Because the ones they try to forget, we remember. I was born in Brookside, Michigan, the kind of place you don't find on postcards. On the edge of Detroit, it was more rust than charm, more struggle than story. Our street was a row of cracked sidewalks and leaning mailboxes, where porch lights flickered but rarely stayed on. The paint peeled from the houses like old scabs, and the air always carried a faint scent of oil, damp cement, and forgotten dreams. Still, for a long time, I believed we were just like any other family. Poor, yes, but surviving. My father, Richard Harper, worked long hours at a scrapyard. He came home each evening with grease-stained hands and a silence that filled the room before he even took off his boots. My mother, Susan, waitressed at a roadside diner off I-96 where she wore tired eyeliner and a smile that barely held together under the weight of half-dollar tips. They weren't cruel then, just tired, just worn down. I learned quickly not to ask for much. New shoes, school trips, even birthday candles felt like luxuries we couldn't afford. But a child's heart finds ways to hope. Doesn't it? Mine found its way through a girl named Jada Reyes. She lived 3 doors down in a home that always smelled like old books and boiled rice. Jada had this wild red braid and a voice that could quiet a whole playground. She'd sneak me comic books her uncle brought home from the flea market and whisper, "Mel, one day we're getting out of this dump, maybe not in a spaceship, but something fast and real." We spent our afternoons crawling through stacks of tires behind the scrapyard, pretending we were treasure hunters or space explorers. Jada believed in stories. She believed in more. And because she did, I started to as well. I imagined myself as someone brave, someone important, in those stolen hours between school and dinner. I wasn't the girl who couldn't afford lunch or whose backpack smelled like thrift store wool. I was someone destined for somewhere else. At night, I'd lie on the lumpy twin mattress in our faded 2-bedroom apartment, staring at the stains on the ceiling, listening to my parents argue in hushed tones down the hall. Money, bills, another notice. And I'd close my eyes, pretending I was on a train headed west, to California, maybe, or New York, places where people didn't know your last name, places where you could start over. Brookside didn't offer much, but it gave me just enough to dream. And sometimes, that's all a child needs. A dream, a friend, and a little corner of the world that hasn't yet fallen apart. But back then, I didn't know what it meant for a world to fall apart. Not yet. Not truly. Not until that one morning, when my mother, eyes strained and hands shaking, told me I wasn't going to school, that we had a special appointment. That was when everything I thought I knew began to quietly unravel. I was 9 when the morning came that would split my life in two. It started quietly, like most autumn mornings in Brookside. The sky was overcast, the kind of gray that felt like it had weight. I was still in my pajamas when my mother called me into the kitchen. She stood by the sink, her back tense, her old green sweater hanging off one shoulder. Her voice cracked when she said, "Malene, you're staying home from school today." I blinked. Why, I feel fine. She turned around, smiled a little too quickly. "It's just a checkup, something special, just to make sure everything's all right." Her hand brushed a crumb off the counter, over and over, like she couldn't stop. My father leaned in the doorway, arms crossed. He didn't say anything at first, just looked past me, like I wasn't even there. Then came his only words that day. "Don't ask questions. Let's go." We got into my dad's old truck, the one that shook when it started, the one I secretly called the coughing machine. I thought we were going to a clinic nearby. Maybe the free health center where Jada got her allergy shots. But we kept driving, past our school, past the diner, past the last streetlight on the edge of town. The further we went, the quieter it became, fields empty, roads long and straight, only the hum of tires and the scratch of the radio stuck between stations. Finally, we pulled up to a gray building standing alone like a bruise against the sky. It wasn't a hospital, no sign, no flag, just a heavy metal door and a few parked cars coated in dust. My mother reached back and touched my knee, her hand cold, trembling. "It'll be quick," she whispered. "Don't be scared." But I was. Inside. The floors were too clean. The air smelled like bleach and something sweeter beneath it, almost like metal. A man in a white coat greeted us. His name was Dr. Avery Lane. His glasses were thin and precise. His smile, well, it looked like it had been practiced in front of a mirror. "Healthy young girl," he said, patting my shoulder. "Just a few little tests. Malene, and you'll be on your way home with a lollipop." I looked up at my parents. My father wouldn't meet my eyes. My mother nodded. Too fast, too eager. I didn't understand. But I obeyed, because when you're 9 and the adults around you nod and smile, you trust them. The room was white, so white it hurt my eyes. The metal table was cold against my legs. A nurse held my hand and told me to stay still. I remember the sting of the needle in my arm, then another one at the base of my neck, then heat, then dizziness. I wanted to sit up, to say something, but my tongue felt thick. My eyelids fluttered like moth wings, and the last thing I heard was Dr. Lane saying, "Excellent response." When I woke up, I was in my own bed. The room smelled like old laundry. My head throbbed, and my limbs felt like wet sandbags. My mother sat beside me, running her fingers through my hair like nothing had happened. "You're okay," she said softly. "They just ran a few tests. All done now." I tried to speak. My throat was dry. "What did they do to me?" She didn't answer, just tucked the blanket tighter around me. That night, I couldn't sleep. My legs twitched under the blanket. By the end of the week, I started to feel a strange tingling in my calves, like invisible pins pricking through the skin. At first, I thought maybe it was normal, just nerves. But then came the weakness. I stumbled trying to get off the couch, fell hard when I tried to run across the living room. My knees buckled without warning. At first, my parents brushed it off. "Stop being clumsy," my father muttered when I slipped on the front steps. "Pay attention to where you're going." But something inside me knew. This wasn't a bruise that would fade or a pulled muscle from playing too hard. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones. I just didn't have the words yet to name it. One day, I tried to climb the pile of tires behind the scrapyard like I always did with Jada. I got halfway up before my legs gave out completely. I fell hard onto the gravel below, the air knocked out of me. Jada screamed for help. My dad carried me home in silence, his jaw tight, his eyes darker than I'd ever seen them. But he never asked if I was okay. That night, lying in bed with ice on my knees, I whispered to myself, "Maybe it'll get better tomorrow." But tomorrow never came, not the kind I was hoping for. And deep down, a part of me, the part that still believed in stories, knew I'd just entered a different kind of one, the kind without heroes, the kind where the monster wasn't under the bed. But the weeks that followed the fall were filled with doctor visits, awkward silences, and a quiet unraveling I couldn't explain. My legs never quite recovered. The sharp pain that once came in flashes now settled into something worse, numbness. I began to fall more often. Sometimes in the kitchen, sometimes at school, always with the same dull thud and the sting of humiliation that lingered longer than any bruise. At first, I used crutches. They clacked down the hallways at school like a sad metronome, each step a reminder that something inside me had gone wrong and no one knew why. Or, maybe, they did. They just weren't telling me. Eventually, the crutches weren't enough. The school nurse pulled my mother aside one afternoon after I collapsed in the lunch line. That night, a second-hand wheelchair appeared in our apartment. It creaked with every movement, the vinyl peeling at the corners, and I hated it immediately. But I didn't protest. I think even then, a part of me had learned that protesting in my house didn't change much. It just made the room quieter. My father said nothing when he brought it inside. He just placed it by my bed, turned off the light, and shut the door behind him. But something else changed too. Something I couldn't quite name at first. My parents started coming home later. My mother no longer looked exhausted. She looked distracted. Her tired eyeliner was replaced with real makeup, foundation, mascara, and lipstick that didn't come from the dollar store. My father's work boots were traded in for polished shoes. One day, he came home driving a brand new SUV. The old coughing machine was gone, like it had never existed. He didn't even mention the change, just tossed me a keychain from the dealership like it was a joke I was supposed to laugh at. A week later, they sat me down and told me we were moving. Fresh start, my mother said, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. New house, better schools, cleaner air. I didn't ask questions. I knew by then that asking only earned me cold looks and vague answers. So I packed what I could, mostly books and a few drawings Jada had given me, and wheeled myself out of the only home I'd ever known. Our new house sat in a polished suburb called Willow Ridge, where the grass always seemed freshly cut and the mailboxes matched. It had a fireplace, a granite kitchen island, and a long driveway that sparkled with pebbled stone. When the real estate agent handed my parents the keys, they laughed like they belonged there, like we had always belonged there. But I didn't. I remember wheeling into the living room the first night and staring at the cathedral ceilings, feeling so small I might disappear into the corners. Everything smelled new: fabric softener, lemon cleaner, candles labeled things like ocean breeze. It was beautiful. It was hollow. Pretty nice. Huh, my dad said, patting the granite countertop like it was some sort of trophy. Business is good. What business? I asked quietly. He glanced at me. Don't start with the questions again. That was the end of it. My mother began redecorating the house like she was auditioning for a magazine spread. She wore jewelry now, small diamonds at first, then a necklace with a gold charm shaped like an infinity symbol. She hosted brunches with other women from the neighborhood. I'd watch from the upstairs window as cars lined the street, the kind with names you only see in commercials. Inside the house, though, the air grew colder. They stopped checking on my schoolwork, stopped asking if I'd eaten, stopped noticing me altogether. And yet, they never seemed more proud of themselves. I heard the laughter at night, the clinking of wine glasses, and the talk of investments and future plans. Sometimes, I'd wheel into the kitchen just in time to hear my name fall from my mother's lips, not with tenderness, but with a sigh, like an unpaid bill, like something they'd outgrown. I was still their daughter, but only in the way an old photograph sits in a drawer, kept out of guilt, never looked at twice, and deep down, even before the worst of it came, I began to understand something had been traded, a cost had been paid, and I was the receipt no one wanted to keep. I was 10 when my mother told me she was pregnant. She said it with a brightness in her voice I hadn't heard in years, maybe ever. She stood at the edge of my doorway that morning, a hand resting gently on her stomach, her eyes already somewhere else. It's going to be different this time, she said softly. A fresh chapter. I nodded, unsure whether she meant for me to be part of that chapter or just quietly observe it from the margins. The months passed quickly. My wheelchair creaked along the polished floors while baby catalogs and paint swatches piled up on the dining table. The nursery was decorated in a sea of soft blues and grays, clouds hand-painted above the crib by a neighbor my parents now called close friends, strangers to me. My name wasn't mentioned in the room. My photos weren't on the wall. The only evidence I existed was the way my chair left faint marks on the hardwood floor. Marks my mother quickly wiped away. Then Noah arrived. 7 pounds, 9 ounces, and the quiet in our house changed. It became joyful, active, alive in a way it had never been when I was the only child. People flooded in with balloons and gift bags. Neighbors brought casseroles. My father cried, something I never saw when I was wheeled out of surgery or when I'd come home bruised from another fall. And my mother, she glowed. She looked at Noah like he was sunlight after a long winter. For a while, I tried to hold on to hope. I told myself that maybe having a brother would mean having someone to talk to, someone who didn't look at me like a burden. I even helped decorate a photo album for him, taping little stars and moons onto the cover with my stiff fingers. I wanted to believe we'd share something, anything, but instead, Noah became the center of the world I was slowly being pushed out of. Every milestone of his life was met with applause. His first giggle, his first steps, his first words. Meanwhile, I became an afterthought. They stopped asking if I wanted to join them at the park, stopped checking if I'd finished my homework, stopped looking at me like I was still part of this family. One afternoon, I asked my mother why she didn't take me along to the zoo with them. I'd heard her planning it all: morning tickets, snacks, the stroller for Noah. I sat at the bottom of the stairs, my fingers curled around the armrests of my chair. She didn't even pause. "Malene," she said without turning around, "you'd just complicate things." Those words stayed with me longer than any scraped knee or fall I'd ever had. Not because they were loud or cruel, but because they were quiet, decisive. She hadn't meant to hurt me. That was what made it worse. She simply meant it. After that, I stopped asking. They began calling me things behind closed doors. Not names, just labels. I overheard my father one night, his voice low but bitter. If it weren't for her, we could finally breathe. My mother's reply was colder than I expected. "We did what we had to." Richard, no regrets. I lay in my bed that night, the ceiling above me blurred by tears I refused to let fall. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was trying too hard to understand, to reason with the impossible, to believe there was still a version of me that belonged. But when I passed by the hallway one morning and heard my mother whisper to her friend on the phone, "Noah is our future. Malene, she's just a remnant of the past." Something inside me cracked, not loudly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but deep enough that the light that had once filled my chest started to flicker. I wasn't their daughter anymore, not really. I was a chapter they'd finished reading, a name they didn't say unless it was to explain why the energy in the room shifted. I had become the echo of a girl they once had, and even though I was still there, breathing, learning, trying, I was already being written out. I was 18 on the Thanksgiving night my family decided I didn't exist. Outside, the Michigan sky had already turned that soft, bruised purple it always does in late November. Inside our house, warmth clung to every surface: roasting turkey in the oven, cinnamon candles flickering on the mantel, laughter echoing from the kitchen to the dining room. The table was set with the finest china, the kind that had never once been used during the hundreds of meals I'd eaten alone in my room. A white linen cloth stretched across the table, dotted with gold-trimmed plates and wine glasses filled with sparkling cider. It looked like a holiday postcard. If you didn't look too closely, you might have thought it was love. Noah sat at the center of it all, cheeks flushed from the attention, a tiny maroon suit jacket tugged tight over his shoulders. My parents beamed at him like he was the sun, and they were lucky enough to orbit it. And I sat near the edge of the table, quietly wheeling myself into a corner where no one had thought to leave room for me. I folded my hands in my lap, waited, hoped. Maybe tonight would be different. My mother, dressed in deep red silk, raised her glass. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her voice light, practiced. "This year, we're especially thankful. Richard and I have worked hard for this life, and for the future we're building." My father stood beside her, resting a hand on Noah's shoulder. His voice was steady, serious. "We have an announcement to make," he said. "One that secures everything we've built. Starting today, our estate, our home, our assets, every account, will be placed into a trust for Noah. He will inherit it all. He is the legacy we've worked for." Applause broke out around the table. Aunts nodded. Uncles clinked glasses. Someone even said, "Smart move." I couldn't move at all. I looked down at the edge of my plate, at the reflection of the chandelier caught in the polished silver rim. My heart beat so loud I thought someone might hear it over the noise. Then I said it, before I could stop myself. Quiet, barely more than a breath. "What about me?" The room froze. Forks hovered mid-air. Laughter died in throats. My mother's hand, still on Noah's shoulder, tightened just slightly. My father turned to me. He didn't sigh. He didn't try to explain. He just looked at me with a kind of flat, exhausted disdain and said, "What about you, Malene? What exactly do you think you've contributed?" The air vanished. My mouth opened, but no words came. I wasn't sure what answer I'd been hoping for. Maybe just acknowledgement. A moment. Anything. Instead, he went on. "You've been a burden we've carried for 18 years. We've done our part. Now it's time we stop pretending." The words hit harder than I'd expected. Not because they were new, but because this time, they were said aloud, in front of everyone, and no one disagreed. Noah blinked at me, confused. He was too young to understand. My mother said nothing, just looked at her plate, as if she could disappear behind the gold-trimmed edges. No one stood up for me. No one asked my father to take it back. I didn't cry, not in front of them. I held the arms of my chair so tight my fingers ached. I stayed through the rest of the meal in silence, while they passed stuffing and toasted to futures that didn't include me. That night, while the house slept and the dishes sat drying in the sink, I packed what little was mine: a few clothes, my worn paperbacks, my notebook, a water bottle, and some protein bars. I moved through the house like a ghost, careful not to make a sound. At the back door, I paused, one hand resting on the cold metal of the ramp they'd built years ago, but rarely maintained. I looked back once. The lights inside were warm. The world I was leaving behind looked so inviting from the outside, but I knew better. I wheeled myself down the ramp into the fog. No money, no destination, no plan. Only one thought stayed with me, repeating like a heartbeat. If I stayed, I'd disappear. So I left, not to be found, but to find something they'd long since stolen from me: myself. Downtown Detroit in late November felt colder than the suburbs ever had. The kind of cold that cut through your coat, your skin, your bones, and settled quietly in your chest like it planned to stay. I wheeled past alleys with broken glass and underpasses lined with cardboard shelters, not knowing exactly where I was going. I only knew I couldn't go back. The first night I spent outside, I barely slept, curled in my chair beneath a thin blanket someone had tossed to me. I watched the city lights blur through my breath. The second night, a woman named Patrice, gray curls, long coat, and eyes that had seen more than most people dared, found me outside a corner deli. "You lost?" she asked. I shook my head. "Just don't have a home anymore." She didn't ask more, just pointed down the street. "St. Hilara's is about 4 blocks that way. They won't fix everything, but they'll give you a bed." St. Hilara Disability Resource Center wasn't pretty. The lights flickered in the hallway, and the beds were lined up like a row of afterthoughts behind beige curtains. But it was warm. It was safe. And for a girl with nowhere else to go, that meant more than anything. They gave me a cot in the back corner and a locker with a rusted lock. My first hot meal in days was a bowl of watery chili and 2 slices of dry bread. But I ate every bite. The staff was kind. If exhausted, the other residents kept to themselves, and so did I. During the day, I read old books from the shelf in the common room or watched people pass by the fogged windows. I didn't speak much, not because I had nothing to say, but because I was still learning how to exist when no one was trying to erase me. It wasn't healing, not yet. It was survival. And that had to be enough. A week into my stay, just as I returned from the park, Maria, the staff member with the tired smile and loose ponytail, called my name. "You've got a letter," she said, holding out a plain white envelope. No return address. Just my name in blue ink to Malene. I stared at it, my chest tightening. "Who brought it?" She shrugged. "Some guy in a ball cap. Dropped it off this morning." Didn't say much. I wheeled to my corner, pulled the curtain shut behind me, and sat staring at the envelope for a long time. My hands trembled as I opened it. One page, folded in half. No signature. Written in jagged, shaky handwriting. "You're not sick. You're a victim. Your parents sold you as a test subject. Medvance Pharmaceuticals. My child was a victim too. Investigate. Malene." I read the note again, Then again. Each word cut deeper than the last. Sold you as a test subject. Medvance. The name meant nothing at first, but the memories did. The sterile white room, the metal table, the needles, Dr. Lane's cold, practiced smile, the sudden decline, the wheelchair, the silence. I wanted to laugh, to crumple the page and call it a sick prank. But something in my chest had already started to twist with recognition. Not disbelief, not confusion, recognition. Because I'd always known something didn't add up. I'd always felt it, lurking beneath the surface of every unanswered question. Every night my parents came home richer and colder than the night before. I'd just never had the words. And now, here they were, written in shaky ink by someone who knew too much. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, listening to the soft snores of the other residents, the buzz of the hallway light that never quite turned off, the steady beat of my own fear. I thought of my mother's words, "We did what we had to." I thought of my father, raising a glass to Noah while I sat invisible in my own house. I thought of the weight in my legs that never left. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel numb. I felt rage, quiet, steady, waiting. If the letter was true, if I had been sold, then someone needed to answer for it. I didn't know where to start. But I knew this I would not stay silent. Not anymore. I kept the letter folded in my jacket pocket like it was something sacred, or dangerous, or both. For days after receiving it, I did nothing but think. I wrote down every memory I could recall: the smell of the clinic, the glint of Dr. Lane's glasses, the cold metal of the table beneath my skin. I scrawled notes in the margins of my journal, drew timelines, and circled moments that once seemed small but now felt laced with warning signs. Still, I needed more than feelings, more than fragments. I needed proof. And if the truth lived anywhere, I knew it had to begin where everything started: Brookside. It had been nearly 9 years since I'd last seen the neighborhood. The bus ride from Detroit was long, slow, and quiet. The moment we crossed into Brookside's familiar outskirts, something tightened in my chest. Time hadn't been kind to the place. Or maybe it had just stayed the same while the rest of the world moved on. The streets still had that worn-down, oil-stained look. The same abandoned tire shop stood at the corner. The same liquor store with the broken neon sign blinked uselessly in the midday sun. But nothing hit harder than seeing our old apartment building. The siding had been repainted, and the windows looked cleaner. But the bones of it, the shape, the smell, the way the front steps still leaned slightly to the left, were exactly the same. A child's bike was parked near the porch. Blue curtains fluttered behind the front window. Someone new lives there now. Someone who had no idea what had once happened inside those walls. I didn't get out of my chair. I didn't knock. I just sat across the street for a while, watching the house I'd once called home, waiting for a memory to become a door. But it didn't. Eventually, I wheeled myself toward a row of houses a few blocks over, the ones that had always smelled like laundry and old newspapers. That's where I found her, Mrs. Rosa, still sitting on her porch, a quilt over her knees, knitting with fingers that looked more bone than skin. She squinted as I approached. "Well, I'll be," she whispered. "Malene Harper. Haven't seen you since you were yay high, falling off that tricycle your daddy refused to fix." I almost smiled. Almost. "I need to ask you something," I said gently. "Do you remember the day my parents took me out of town for that health checkup?" Her needles paused. She looked up slowly, eyes now sharper than they had any right to be at her age. "I remember your mama crying when they came back," she said. "Wouldn't say why, just hugged you too tight, like she was afraid you'd disappear." I swallowed. "And after that, they moved out pretty quickly," she said. "Bought a new car, then gone within weeks. No goodbyes, just vanished. Everyone thought it was strange." I hesitated, then pulled the letter from my pocket and handed it to her. She read it in silence, her lips pressed into a single, pale line. When she finished, she didn't look shocked, just tired. "You're not the only one," she said softly. "Back then, a few kids went missing. Not all at once, not loud, just slipped through the cracks. We all heard whispers about a clinic off the highway, not a hospital, not a place you'd go if you wanted to come back. She lowered her voice, glanced toward the street. People said it wasn't legal, said they paid families, especially poor ones, especially those no one would miss. My chest burned. Do you remember where it was? I asked. Somewhere off Highway 71, gray building, no sign. People stayed away. I thanked her and turned to leave, my heart heavy with confirmation I hadn't wanted but somehow needed. As I rolled past the scrapyard where I used to play, I saw him, Mr. Joe, sitting outside the old diner, sipping coffee from a cracked mug. "Malene," he called out, "you're that Harper girl." "Right," I nodded. "Do you remember that clinic off Highway 71? He stared at me a moment, then nodded once. "Your dad got rich fast after that. Didn't he?" he said. "No one ever believed it was just the scrapyard. We all knew something was off." His voice dropped. "I heard they tested drugs on kids, poor kids, kids who didn't have a future to begin with." I couldn't breathe. I wheeled away before my voice could betray me. Brookside hadn't changed, but I had. The place that raised me had always held its secrets, but now I was done being one of them. That night, back at the center, I took out the letter again and underlined one sentence: investigate. Malene. I wrote one more beneath it: find the clinic, find Dr. Lane, find the truth. Returning to that house was the hardest thing I'd done since leaving it. Even as the cab pulled up to the curb, I felt my pulse echo in my ears. The same white picket fence, the same manicured lawn, the same porch light that flickered if you stared at it long enough. From the outside, it looked like the kind of home people dreamed of. But I knew better. I knew what had been buried behind those walls. I rang the doorbell. Seconds passed. Then the door opened, and there she was, my mother, Susan Harper, perfectly polished, hair curled just so, like nothing had unraveled at all. "Malene," she said, as if the name tasted foreign. "What are you doing here? I left some things in my old room," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "Just want to grab them, then I'll be gone." Her eyes flicked past me to the street, not worried, just calculating. Behind her, my father appeared, arms crossed, jaw clenched. "Didn't we make things clear at Thanksgiving?" he asked. "You walked out. That was your choice. I'm not here to fight," I said. "I won't stay long." There was a long pause. Then, with a sharp breath, my mother stepped aside. "Fine, but don't go digging through things that aren't yours." I nodded, wheeled past them, and rolled down the hall. The house smelled of lemons and cold marble. The silence was suffocating. My old room was untouched. Same pale curtains. Same bookshelf. Still holding the worn paperbacks I'd read 1,000 times just to escape. But I wasn't here for nostalgia. That night, I waited until the house went still. My parents had retreated to their room. I could hear the low hum of the television, the occasional creak of floorboards above me. When everything fell quiet, I made my move. The study had always been locked when I was a child, my father's sacred ground. But now, the door gave with a gentle push. Inside, the air felt colder, somehow heavier. A desk lamp sat at the far corner, its neck bent like it had secrets to keep. I rolled toward the desk and began searching. Drawers filled with old receipts, stacks of bills, nothing unusual. I checked the bookshelf, the floor beneath the rug. Still nothing. But then, one last drawer, bottom right, the one my father had once warned me never to touch. It was locked, of course. I remembered the rug, carefully. I peeled it back, and there it was. A small silver key, taped to the underside of the floorboard. My hands trembled as I slid it into the lock. Click. The drawer creaked open. Inside a thick folder, bound with a rubber band. The label read simply, Medvance, 2009. I pulled it out slowly, heart hammering. The first page was a contract, typed in clinical language, signed by both my parents and a representative from Medvance Pharmaceuticals. Terms like brokerage services, subject eligibility, and non-disclosure agreement jumped out like flames on dry paper. Then came the payment records, wire transfers, tens of thousands of dollars. Each is marked with reference codes. One line stopped me cold. Subject E. Harper, Malene, status active trial participant. It was me. Next, a list, 17 names, each one is labeled with an outcome: neurological damage, organ failure, deceased. My name was fourth from the top: permanent paralysis, lower extremities. And finally, a note in my father's handwriting: quick, careless. Elliot =sign success. Continue cooperation. Maintain discretion. I stared at it for a long time. All these years. I'd been trying to understand why. Why my legs stopped working. Why my parents got rich overnight. Why the warmth in their eyes disappeared and was replaced by shame, by silence. And now, here it was, the answer, quiet, folded in a drawer, written in ink. I stuffed the documents into my backpack, sealed the drawer, and turned off the lamp. I wheeled back to my room and didn't sleep. At dawn, I left without a word. No goodbyes, no explanations. They had taken my body, my childhood, my place in the family. But I had the truth. And this time, I wasn't going to bury it. The morning after I left my parents' house, I returned to St. Hilaire with a backpack full of truth and a weight I wasn't sure how to carry. I sat in my corner of the center. The folder from my father's drawer spread open across the small desk. Bank records, contracts, names, 17 of them. I stared at the list until my eyes blurred, then underlined each one in pen, like counting the lost. I didn't know where to begin. I had no legal team, no strategy, just a voice that had been silent for too long, and a truth too dangerous to keep to myself. So I started where anyone without power starts: the internet. I searched forums for medical malpractice, support groups for survivors of experimental drug trials, buried inside threads with timestamps from years ago. I found a few names that matched the list in my folder: a boy named Marcus, a girl named Emily, a man named David whose brother had never come home from a clinic. I sent emails, messages, even handwritten letters. When I couldn't find a way to reach them digitally, I didn't tell them everything. Not at first. Just enough. Enough to say, "You're not alone. I have proof. I have your name." And I know what they did. Some never responded. Others wrote back cautiously, but one by one, the silence began to crack. Angela Brooks, Marcus's mother, was the first to meet me. We sat across from each other in a public library, tucked between rows of outdated encyclopedias and stained carpet. She held the folder in her lap like it might catch fire. "He was 8, she whispered, voice shaking. "Your mother, Susan, was the one who told me about the program. Said it was a free health checkup. Said it was a gift for families like ours." I nodded. I didn't have to explain. We both knew what had happened next. "I trusted her," she said, "and Marcus hasn't walked since. We cried in that library, not just for what we'd lost, but for the years we'd spent believing we were alone." Angela connected me with others. One led to another. Soon, there were 7 of us: Angela, Marcus, Emily, who now lives with a ventilator, David, a woman named Serena, whose younger sister died during a trial, an older man named Luis, who thought his brother had simply run away, and me. We called ourselves the Survivors. We met for the first time in a crumbling old church at the edge of the city. The walls were cracked, the pews are dusty, but the light through the stained glass windows still felt like hope. I remember rolling into that room and seeing them, faces marked by pain, but not defeat, people who'd been broken in ways no one ever should be, but still found their way there, still showed up. Angela opened the meeting with her voice low and even. "We're not victims anymore," she said. "Not if we stand together." We took turns speaking, telling our stories, sharing details we'd been too afraid, or too ashamed, to say out loud. Emily spoke through a machine, her breath mechanical but her words clear. They took everything from us, but we still have our truth. In that room, we weren't test subjects or forgotten kids from broken towns. We were witnesses, and we were ready. After everyone spoke, they turned to me. "What do we do now?" someone asked. I looked down at the folder in my lap, pages of evidence I never asked to carry. "We fight," I said, "not just for us, but for the kids who never made it to this room." Silence followed, then a slow nod, then another, until the air felt different, charged, real. In that moment, I knew we couldn't undo what had been done, but we could make sure the world finally saw it. Not hidden in a drawer, not buried beneath polite smiles and clean driveways, but exposed, loud, undeniable. The survivors had found each other, and we weren't going to stay quiet. Lauren Carter didn't flinch when I placed the folder on her desk. She didn't gasp or pause dramatically like people do in courtroom dramas. She just opened it, page by page, her eyes scanning with a sharpness that made me feel seen, not pitied, not doubted, but believed. She was the first lawyer who didn't ask. "Are you sure?" she asked. "Are you ready?" Lauren had spent over a decade fighting human rights violations, specializing in medical ethics cases that most firms were too afraid to touch. When I told her about Medvance, about Subject E, about the money trail buried in my father's drawer and the list of 17 names, she nodded once, then said, "This isn't just a lawsuit, this is a reckoning." With her help, the survivors filed a class action suit in federal court. Medvance Pharmaceuticals, Richard and Susan Harper, charged with human trafficking, unlawful experimentation, and child abuse. The documents were airtight consent forms forged, payments traced, victims located. We had names, we had signatures, we had voices that had been silenced for too long. And then the news broke. I thought the story might make a few local papers, maybe a segment buried late night on public access television. I was wrong. By the end of the week, headlines flooded every platform. Young woman sues pharmaceutical giant. And her parents. Test subject E speaks out. She was paralyzed at 9. Now she wants justice. But the one that stuck the most burned itself into every interview, every clickbait thumbnail. Was this the girl who sued her own family? That title clung to me like smoke. It didn't matter how many times I said they sold me. Didn't matter how many children we had on that list. The world, as always, chose the scandal over the truth. Comment sections were a war zone. Some people called me brave, a warrior. Others called me selfish, a liar. A broken daughter is trying to ruin her parents' reputation for a quick payout. "You don't betray your blood," one comment read. But they already had. Media vans were parked outside St. Hilaire. Reporters with bright teeth and dull questions tried to corner me outside the grocery store. I stopped checking my messages after the threats started. "You're a disgrace. You should be ashamed. They took care of you, and this is how you repay them." I wanted to scream that they hadn't taken care of me. They'd taken everything from me, my legs, my childhood, my place in a family that never really claimed me. But I knew arguing with strangers behind screens wouldn't heal me. Or them. I turned off my notifications. But I didn't stop, because for every hateful message, there was another. Quiet, shaken, thankful. I think something like this happened to my sister. My mom signed a form when I was 7. "I've never been the same. Please don't give up. We need you to keep going." Lauren warned me that the courtroom would be brutal, that Medvance would bring lawyers in suits that cost more than our combined childhoods, that my parents would likely deny everything. "I don't care," I said. "I just want it on the record. I want the world to hear me say it out loud." And so we prepared. Depositions, statements, gathering documents, witnesses. Every night I sat in the corner of St. Hilaire, highlighter in hand, reading over every word like my life depended on it. Because it did. One afternoon, while we were reviewing a witness statement, Lauren looked at me and said, "Do you realize what you've done? Malene, you've built something no one can ignore." But I didn't feel powerful. Not yet. I still felt like the girl wheeling herself away from a house that never had a place set for her. The girl who asked, "What about me?" and got silence in return. Still, I was no longer alone. We had a case. We had the truth. And for the first time, the world would have to listen. The day of the trial arrived beneath a steel-gray sky that looked like it could break open at any moment. Rain tapped against the courthouse windows in a slow, steady rhythm, like a clock counting down the minutes to something irreversible. Inside, everything felt colder, the hallways, the seats, even my breath. The federal courtroom in downtown Detroit was packed. Reporters, lawyers, spectators, survivors, rows of people I didn't know, but whose eyes held a quiet tension I recognized too well. Some looked curious, others skeptical, but a few, A few nodded at me as I rolled past them, like they already knew the shape of my story. I took my place beside Lauren Carter at the plaintiff's table, calm on the outside. But my hands gripped the armrests of my wheelchair so tightly my knuckles ached. Across the room sat the defense Medvance's attorneys, 5 men in expensive suits, and my parents, Richard and Susan Harper. They didn't look at me when they entered. My father wore a pressed gray suit, his face carved from stone. My mother wore black, not mourning, just performance. Her eyes scanned the room, but never stopped on mine. I wasn't surprised. The judge entered. Proceedings began. Opening statements passed in a blur of words I barely absorbed: consent violations, fraudulent contracts, child endangerment. The language was sharp, precise, but no legal term could truly capture what had been done. Then came the witnesses. Emily was wheeled in first, pale and frail, her breathing machine barely louder than a whisper. She spoke through a computerized device, each word slow and deliberate. I was 8. They said it was safe. I never walked again. Next was David. He spoke of his younger brother, how he went in for a trial, how the family was promised a better life, how he never came home. My parents were desperate, he said, voice cracking. They trusted people who saw their poverty as an opportunity. Then Marcus, taller now, older. But the scar in his eyes was still a child's. They used us, he said, and they got rich doing it. Each testimony was like a strike of lightning, brief, bright, impossible to ignore, and each one pointed in the same direction. Toward Medvance, toward Richard and Susan Harper, toward me. When it was my turn, the courtroom went still. I rolled to the witness stand, hands trembling slightly as I took the oath. For a moment, I just sat there, staring across the room at the people who had raised me, who had dressed my wounds, packed my lunches, and signed away my body like it was a line item in a budget. Then I spoke. I was 9 when my legs stopped working. I began. They told me it was a condition, a mystery, something no one could explain. But they knew. They always knew. I described the clinic, the needles, Dr. Lane's glassy stare, the silence at home afterward, the sudden wealth, the way I was pushed out of my own family, replaced, renamed as a burden. They didn't just take my body, I said, my voice steady. They erased my place in their story. I paused, then looked directly at the defense table. My parents didn't just abandon me, they sold me. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Susan lowered her eyes, but Richard didn't flinch. He stood when called to testify, his voice clipped, rehearsed. Malene is confused, he said, ungrateful. She's twisting everything for attention, for money. Lauren responded by presenting the documents, every transfer, every signature, every piece of paper he thought would stay hidden. Then came the final blow: internal emails from Medvance, leaked by a whistleblower, showing they knew the trials were causing neurological damage, that they continued anyway, that the Harpers were referred to as reliable suppliers. The silence that followed felt like an inhale that never exhaled. 3 weeks of testimony, 3 weeks of buried truths pulled into the light. When the jury returned, I didn't breathe until the judge read the verdict aloud. Guilty. Richard and Susan Harper, sentenced to 40 years in federal prison for human trafficking and child abuse. Medvance Pharmaceuticals, ordered to pay over $85 million in damages. Several executives were arrested pending further investigation. I sat there as the courtroom shifted around me. Reporters stood, cameras clicked, people wept. My parents were handcuffed, led out through the side door. My mother looked back once, her lips trembling. Malene, she whispered. I'm sorry. But I said nothing. Because some apologies come too late. And I was no longer the girl who waited to be seen. I was the one who made sure the world couldn't look away. 10 years have passed since the day the verdict was read. 10 years since I sat in that courtroom and watched the people who gave me life be led away in chains. Since Medvance was exposed for what it truly was, not a company, but a machine built on silence, on suffering, on children like me. I still visit the St. Ilara Disability Resource Center every week, not because I need a place to sleep, or food, or shelter, but because that's where my new life began. And sometimes, You have to return to the ashes to remember the fire that shaped you, with the $1.2 million settlement awarded to me as the primary victim in the case. I didn't buy a house. I didn't vanish into comfort. I built something. Survivor's Voice, a nonprofit, a place, a promise. For people like Marcus, like Emily, like the dozens who reached out in the years that followed. People who had no one believed them. People who thought they were the only ones. People who thought survival was the end of the story. But it wasn't. Survival was only the beginning. Today, I sit in a circle of chairs, in a quiet room lit by morning sun through dusty windows, an old church converted into a meeting space. There's a whiteboard in the corner, a chipped coffee pot on the table, and a kind of peace in the air that comes only when pain is spoken aloud and finally heard. Across from me sits a girl, barely 16. Her left leg ends at the knee. Her eyes carry the weight of things she's never said out loud. She shifts in her chair, uncertain, hiding behind long sleeves and long silences. I tell my story, not all at once, just pieces: the sterile room, the letter, the drawer, the day the courtroom fell silent. I tell it gently, not to shock, but to show. When I finish, there's a long pause. Then the girl whispers, almost too softly to hear, "If you could do it, I think I can too." I smile. Not because I'm proud, not because I want to be a symbol, but because I know exactly what it means to say that sentence out loud for the first time. I nod and reply, "You can," because I'm no longer the girl who sat at the end of the Thanksgiving table, hoping to be chosen, no longer the secret no one wanted to claim, no longer a case file, no longer a burden. Now, I'm a voice, a path, a beginning. I lost my legs, but I found something greater. I found the truth. I found my voice. And if I could find it, you can too.